you share a personal moment when you made an expensive purchase. You realized that you no longer needed to worry about money.
I was in San Francisco in 2012. And for context, I was making pretty good money. I was there for a wedding and I had some free time, so I went down to Union Square and there was a Prada store. And I didn't know what Prada was, but I went in there and I saw this pair of boots and I said, wow, that is the most gorgeous pair of boots I have ever seen. Men's boots. So I picked it up and I looked at the price tag and they were $1,000 for the boots. Mm-hmm. And this is 12 years ago. So I was like, that's outrageous. So I walked out of the store and I did a couple laps around Union Square and I started thinking I have money, like I can afford the boots. And up until this moment, I have been the cheapest bastard you'd ever meet in your entire life. And I said, I can afford the shoes. I'm going to get the shoes. So I got the shoes. And also, I then went to Nordstrom and bought like a Xenia shirt and an Eaton shirt. Mm-hmm. So I just went nuts. I spent like $2,000 in San Francisco. And that was the moment where I basically figured out I made all this money. I can actually spend it on stuff, which was a big psychological turn for me. I actually think it is a sin to not spend money if you have it.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil Baranowski, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on the show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Jared Dillian. He's a writer, trader, musician, entrepreneur, and educator. He's an author of many excellent books, among them No Worries, How to Live a Stress-Free Financial Life, Streak Freak, Money and Madness of Lehman, All the Evil in This World, and most recently, Night Moves and Other Stories. Jared, how are you? Nice to see you.
Good. Thanks for having me.
I have so many questions about your books, especially the most recent one, but I like to start those conversations from the beginning, if you let me. And I like to ask my guests about the early days. And you share some in the books that I'd love to explore. Your childhood upbringing, and how do you think that time shaped you, your relationship with money, and the career path that you chose?
Yeah. My parents divorced when I was 7. My dad was a Coast Guard aviator, and up until they got divorced, I moved around a lot. I was born in Cape Cod and moved to Kodiak, Alaska, and moved to Clearwater, Florida, and then to Governor's Island in New York City. So I was living in Governor's Island when they got divorced, and then I moved to Connecticut to live with my mom and my grandmother. Um, you talked about relationship with money. Like we had no money at the time. Like we were,
Mm.
very poor. Um, and that was the case mostly growing up in Connecticut. Um, I had a great education. The schools that I went to were fantastic. I ended up going to the Coast Guard Academy where I majored in math. And after I graduated, I went to a ship, a Coast Guard cutter out of Washington State. Started getting interested in finance. Was also interested in writing. My initial plan was to get out of the Coast Guard after 5 years and get an MFA and become a writer. And I told my mom that plan, and she said that's a terrible idea, that I wasn't going to have any money. So she said I had to make some money. So I went to business school, went to the University of San Francisco, got my MBA. While I was in business school, I spent a couple years on the P Coast Options Exchange, and then I went to Lehman Brothers, was at Lehman Brothers for 7 years, and had a great career at Lehman. On the bankruptcy, I left and started my newsletter, the Daily Dirt Nap. I've been doing that for 16 years, and like you said, I've written 5 books and had a radio show for a period of time. I've written other newsletters. I was a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion for like 5.5 years. I've done a bunch of stuff. So right now I live in South Carolina.
And you keep writing. You never stopped.
Yeah.
I want to go back to one of the earlier books that I'd love to introduce the audience to, and some might remember it. You wrote the book All the Evil in This World, and you take us back to the year 2000 and the story of the Palm spinoff. You tell the story through 7 separate voices, and you talk about the banks behind, the calculations, the deal, the humans, and not necessarily the best humans from what I remember. What's the one lesson we can take away from those events? Because it sounds like a story that has repeated since, although it's been a quarter of a century.
Did you read it? Did you read All the Evil of This World?
Yeah, back in the day, yes.
Oh wow. I mean, it remains my favorite book. It was the hardest book to write.
Mm-hmm.
It's an incredibly complex book just in terms of the engineering of it, because you have, these 7 characters, 7 chapters, and they're all overlapping. So there's a lot of engineering in the book, and I picked the book with the highest degree of difficulty. And people, out of all my books, that has the lowest reviews on Amazon. By the way, it has 4 stars, but if you see a book with 4 stars on Amazon, that is usually a bad book. People don't like that book. Usually the Amazon has this weighted rating system, and if a book is 4 stars, it's not very good. So people objected to it because it is the filthiest book you will ever read. It is, just over the top, crass, and but really the title of it, All the Evil of This World, is ironic. It was intended to be ironic. And, if you look at this just kind of straight on and you say, here are all these very flawed and bad people in the story, that they are, what they are doing, I do not consider to be evil, right? It's just normal moral human failings. You have a broker who is a drug addict, he's a cocaine addict, and you have all kinds of stuff. But I think it's a fantastic book. It's actually pretty old now. It's about 8 years old. So
I'd love to reread it after hearing you and bring back those memories. But let's talk about the more recent book that I really enjoyed, the No Worries, How to Live a Stress-Free Financial Life. There was a story there that really struck a chord with me. You share a personal moment when you made an expensive purchase. And when I was reading it, I was thinking that you realized, that's how I heard it, that you no longer needed to worry about money. Can you bring that story back? You were shopping, and you...
I was in San Francisco in 2012. And for context, I'd been doing my newsletter for 4 years, and it was reasonably successful. I was making maybe $350,000 a year, which is pretty good money. I was there for a wedding, and I had some free time, so I went down to Union Square, and there was a Prada store. I don't know if it's still there, but there was a Prada store. and I didn't know what Prada was. I had no idea what it was. I was not clued into fashion or anything. I didn't know what kind of brand it was. But I went in there, and I saw this pair of boots, and I said, "Wow, that is the most gorgeous pair of boots I have ever seen, men's boots." So I picked it up and I looked at the price tag, and they were $1,000 for the boots, and this is 12 years ago. So I was like, that's outrageous. So I walked out of the store and I did a couple laps around Union Square and I started thinking about it. I'm like, like my business is pretty good. Like I have money. Like I can afford the boots. Like, and up until this moment, I have been the cheapest bastard you'd ever meet in your entire life. Like, I was wearing like Johnston and Murphy shoes, like $75 shoes or something like that. And I said, I can afford the shoes. I'm going to get the shoes. So I got the shoes. Um, and also, while I don't think I put this in the book, but while I was in San Francisco, I then went to Nordstrom and bought like a Xenia shirt and an Eaton shirt. So I just went nuts. I spent like $2,000 in San Francisco. And that was the moment where I basically figured out that, I worked on Wall Street. I've done really well. I've made all this money. I can actually spend it on stuff, which was a big psychological turn for me. So I actually kind of have this philosophy that I actually think it is a sin to not spend money if you have it, right? I have a friend who is an investment banker. He's worth like $30 million. He lives in a crappy house in a crappy neighborhood. He's never bought a new car. He buys cheap clothes. And he gets enjoyment out of logging on to the bank and looking at the number every day, right? Like and I find that repulsive. I find that to be incredibly repulsive. Money is meant to be enjoyed. That's what it's for. Within reason. I mean, you can go into debt and spend all your money and stuff like that. But if you have money, it's meant to be enjoyed. I'm doing this podcast from a house, my new house, which I spent 3 years building. It is a 10,000 square foot house, right? And when we first bought the land and we were talking to the architect, I ran the numbers, I figured out how much it would cost. I said, we can do it. We can absolutely do it. We can afford this house. We should do it. We have a moral obligation to do it, and it's not a stretch, So anyway.
I have a couple of questions. So one, I'm kind of going to work my way backwards. And in your book, you write about, saving and being disciplined about your finances, the one about no worries. But I think the habits that get us to that position where we have the savings and the capital and we can start invest, those habits get us to a place, but then from that place, we might not have the skills or even the ability to appreciate what the money can do for us, the joy of actually spending, right?
So really, in our lifetimes, we actually have to be two different people, right? So from age 22 to 45, you are accumulating assets, right? And then around age 45 to 50, you switch and you are decumulating assets. You are spending the money that you have. And people are generally good at one or the other, but not both. They can't be both people, right? And that's the part that is hard, to make that mental switch.
It's almost like you have to unlearn and relearn something that became such a big part of you. And I notice it, and I've been in meetings, managing money for families over the last 20 years, where people, my colleagues at different points in time, would be so proud that they spent the weekend traveling from New York to New Jersey to buy some home supplies and saved, pennies on them. And I would think, and not speak up, I was probably too young in the room to speak up, but I would say, well, given the paycheck that you receive, do you think that was the best way to spend your Sunday? And I kept that question to myself, and I still don't know the answer, but it brought them so much joy that they had to share it with us at the Monday meeting, right? I'm sure you've seen it too, right? So I feel
yeah. I mean, I can't tell who this is, but a friend of mine was a financial advisor at one of the big firms. and one of his clients was a billionaire, $4 billion, and you have definitely heard of this person. You have heard of this person, and he said this guy was always hitting him up for like free dinners and free tickets and stuff like that, like stuff that costs like $70. He was always hitting him up for free stuff. The guy was worth $4 billion, you know, so.
I think it's about what brings you joy, and it's very, very hard to undo it. You know, I look at myself, and I'm pretty disciplined about saving, and I always wonder where it came from. I was born in Poland, and then New York became my home. As an adult, I went to schools around Europe. But when I was a kid, Poland, it was the last decade of Cold War Poland. The stores were empty. It was a gray. I didn't realize that that's unique. I thought the whole world looks like that. And then Poland opened up to the world, and supermarkets opened up. But I think in those formative years, the first decade, to me, shopping was not something enjoyable. It was something you had to do and find a way to find, basic goods, because there was a black market, gray market in those goods. You couldn't find those things in the store. So when I moved to the US and people would make a weekend out of it and go shopping from a place to a place, I didn't really see the joy in it. And I'm sure it helped me, accumulate the initial capital. But it took me time. So when I was reading that story that you share about shopping for shoes and going to those nice stores, I thought you were going through the same revelation of like, hey, I saved that money. It's not supposed just to sit there.
Yeah,
I can actually spend it and enjoy it. And I think it's a great revelation. And I like the two stages, how you present it. So yeah, fascinating way. But I also saw through this book, this evolution, and I'm curious if you can share more about yourself, because you went through this big evolution from the early years to the later years, and you brought up, obviously, the childhood without money. But where are you on that journey these days? It sounds like you're in the part where you're enjoying spending money and you're going to be parting with some of it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. These days I donate a lot. Which I didn't start to do until about 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I started making significant charitable donations, which actually, I actually forego consumption so that I can actually donate, because that actually brings me the most joy. I donate most of my money to my high school in Connecticut. I was a musician. I was in the marching band. I was drum major of the marching band, and they have a very successful marching band. And I have endowed a scholarship, and I bought new uniforms for the band, and I've done instruments, and that's really what I like to do. And that's something that people don't usually get to do. So.
And you point out something that I grew up with, that, education is something that nobody can take away from you. Like parents, grandparents always told me that you could lose the money, you could lose everything, but education is something that will be with you. And I think going back to your high school, I think you're trying to give back in that way, because you can tell how empowering it can be to provide education. And there's so many more options. I want to jump around a little bit, and I want to talk about Lehman, where you spent some time and you wrote a book about it. And you tell a story how you were basically an outsider trying to get in and talking to hiring managers. And I have a quote that you would say that nobody can work harder than me. Nobody's willing to put in the hours that I will put in. I'm insane. You remember saying that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Did it work?
Well, it worked for Lehman. I interviewed at a bunch of banks, and all the banks today and back then are very culturally different. They have different cultures. And, I told that to the people at JP Morgan, and they didn't really see the value in somebody that was insane, that worked harder than everybody else. I told that to people at Lehman Brothers, which was Citigroup at the time. At Lehman, I basically demonstrated, I said, look, for the past 2 years, I've been sleeping 2 hours a night, working on the options floor, going to school, and working for the Coast Guard all at the same time. Mm-hmm. I'm like, that is a level of dedication that no other applicant has. Like, you should hire me. And that was a strong selling point for them, which really speaks to the culture of the firm. It was a firm where people did work very, very hard, where on a trading floor, where most people go home at 5 o'clock, at 8 o'clock, it would still be full, like people were still working. So.
Do you think that experience shaped you in a certain way?
Yeah, it gave me the gray hair. Yeah, that was, that was the most stress I have ever experienced in my entire life. Running the ETF trading desk, making markets in ETFs was the most stressful thing I have ever done. It was insane. So.
What's your memory of Lehman falling apart at that time? I'll share with you that week when it was about to happen. I was working at an investment firm in New York, and there was some event that Lehman was hosting. And Lehman was so many different things, but they were hosting something for buy-side analysts. And I went to the Lehman building a few days before the collapse, and the building was empty, and there were people in some rooms discussing things, but the event was canceled, and they didn't even tell us that it was canceled. So I left the building, and a few days later, there were big announcements what happened to Lehman. But I'm curious about your memory of it, because you were much closer to it, right in the middle of it.
It was kind of an open secret that Lehman was going to go bankrupt. I knew in the summer. We would hear it from our clients. Like, we would go out to dinners with hedge fund clients, and they would say, "You guys are going bankrupt." Mm-hmm. We were really the last to know. But I actually started looking for jobs that summer, in the summer of 2008. I didn't really find anything appealing, so I decided to do the newsletter. It was, the thing that stood out to me was, I had already made up my mind to do the Daily Dirtnet, my newsletter. So if Lehman went bankrupt, not only was it inconsequential, it actually was a good thing. Because it's really tough to walk away from a Wall Street job when you're getting paid all that money. It's very tough to walk away from that. Most people don't walk away. Most people stay too long and they get fired, right? So Lehman going bankrupt was going to give me sort of a golden parachute to go do my own thing. And then what happened is that the week after the bankruptcy, the broker-dealer was bought by Barclays, and everybody was going to get to keep their jobs, including me. And I could have stayed on at Barclays, and I was being offered a lot of money to do so, and I actually turned it down. I turned it down, and I went off on my own. So
you were ready for the next chapter.
Yep.
And that makes me think of time. And I have a quote from one of your essays. And the topic of time comes up a lot in my discussions here. We talk about money and investing, and a lot of my guests end up bringing up time. And I know that you've given a lot of thought to that. And you write, "Time is the most precious commodity in the world. I have taken some big financial losses in my career, and none of them have bothered me that much. Some of my friends have been astounded at my impassivity in the face of crippling losses. Easy come, easy go. You can always make more money, but you can't make more time." Can you share more?
Man, actually, I kind of got goosebumps when you read that. I guess that was really good. Time is the most important thing in the world, right? And I have a saying, which is, the most important decision you will ever make is what to do with the next 24 hours. How are you going to spend the next 24 hours, right? Mm-hmm. That is the most important. And we make this decision on a daily basis, So, people, look, you're interviewing me. I have 5 books. I worked at Lehman. I've done all this stuff. I have a newsletter. I had a radio show. I teach at university. How do I do all this stuff? It's because I value time, right? Every second is precious, right? So it's funny. I have a friend who is also very successful. He runs, I guess, a derivatives firm or something like that. And he's always asking me, "Hey, have you seen this show on Netflix? Have you seen this show on Netflix? Have you seen that show?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't. I have no idea what you're talking about because I am working. Like, I am doing stuff. And if I'm not working, I am deliberately having fun. Like, I'm like specifically spending, but I'm not sitting on the couch just passively watching TV. Like, that is hours of my life that I can never get back, So time, time is the most important thing in the world. Like I said, you can't make more time. So
There was a point in your life, the work that you were doing and sleeping a few hours a day, when you really didn't have more time. And I hope that these days you have a lot more time for yourself, and then you can have a much more balanced way of living than back in the day.
well, I am going to watch the Yankees tonight on TV. I'm going to watch the Yankees play the Royals. So,
Well, I have a question about the new book, and you
yes.
kind of set the stage why it's a different book. I read it, and I have questions about some individual stories that I want to dive into in a second. But for the benefit of the audience, how did this book come about? I have a feeling it's a very important book for you, and the format, the stories, and so on. It's different in some way. But tell me more.
Well, I love short stories as an art form. I would much rather read short stories than novels. I have dozens of collections of short stories in my library. I've read them all. Um, I started reading short stories in the 90s, and the art form has changed significantly since then. Stories used to have a plot. They had, an arc and a resolution. Stories today don't. It's very postmodern. There's no plot there. It's just kind of meandering in the author's consciousness. I wrote 5 or 6 short stories in grad school for my MFA, and ultimately I wrote more than that. I submitted 12 stories to 100 different literary magazines, and none of them got published, right? So, I'm a consumer of these literary magazines, so I read this stuff and I'm like, I don't get it. Like, what this is writers talking to other writers, okay? The only people reading these stories are other writers, not readers, right? It's it's a little bit like the academic world, right? Where you have a journal in archaeology and the only people who read the journal are other archaeologists. It's like academics talking to other academics, right?
Sure.
So it's really the same thing. And I'm like, this this is a perversion of what the art form is supposed to be like, right? You're supposed to feel something when you read a short story, right? It's supposed to have an emotional impact, right?
True.
And I mean, you've read the book. You would agree that the short stories have an emotional impact.
They do.
Even writing some of these stories was very hard. Like in 2 of the stories I wrote, I actually cried while I was I'm like writing it, tears streaming down my face, like writing these stories. So like what I'm trying to do, I kind of have this one man crusade is to bring back that art form from 30 years ago. I went to a writers conference in Kansas City back in February, and this book, I was pitching it to indie publishers. And I said, look, like I'm kind of a throwback from the 90s, like John Updike, Barry Hannah, Raymond Carver, whatever. Like I'm just, these are stories, they're very plot heavy. And they would look at me and they say, I don't think you're going to have, it's not going to be easy for you to sell that book.
Mm-hmm.
So, so anyway, that's what Night Moves is. It is stories that are real stories that are pleasurable to read. So,
No, I enjoyed every story, and each takes you on its separate journey. And I want to dive into a handful just to give the audience a flavor of what's to come. And one of the earlier stories, I think one of the first, if not the first, is about somebody that wins a lottery. And the way you tell the story, I feel like I'm the one that won the lottery, and I'm on this journey. So in the book, you tell a story of a troubled lottery winner who is catching a first-class flight to collect his winnings, basically. What can we learn from his experience? Because it's something that a lot of us have thought, had I won, what would I do? Especially in the next, you talked about 24 hours, but here you beautifully bridged the 2 ideas. The next 24 hours, what happens?
yeah, I mean, so that story is about a couple of things. And first of all, that's the weakest story in the collection. It's actually my least favorite. It's
Really, I liked it a lot.
Yeah, it's my least favorite. But it's about It's about self-sabotage. A lot of the stories are about self-sabotage. That's kind of a recurring theme. It's about this subconscious desire for self-sabotage. It's about alcoholism and about how, as an alcoholic, you don't, bad things kind of happen to you exogenously all the time, and you can't figure out why bad things keep happening to you. And it's because of your drinking, but you can't make the connection. So it's about alcoholism. And also it's about, it just, everybody likes to think about what they would do if they won the lottery, right? Like, I don't know how many lottery tickets you buy. I buy lottery tickets all the time. And the most fun thing after you buy a lottery ticket is, what would I do if I won, and actually going through that thought process. So here in South Carolina is a state where you can remain anonymous and collect your winnings, which is terrific. But the lottery office is in Columbia. So I've talked this over with my wife. Like, we would wait like 3 or 4 weeks, and we would put on like these hoodies, right? So nobody could recognize us. And we would park like 3 or 4 miles away, and we would take a cab over to the lottery office and go, wait, we have this whole plan, right? And it's just really fun to think about. And I don't think there's ever been a short story written about somebody that won the Powerball. I just thought that would be fun. So
I'll tell you a quick story that I met somebody at a dinner party that worked for a company that approaches lottery winners. And he's probably the only person in my life that has met actually that many real lottery winners. And they would basically offer some sort of a deal. So the winner would get a single payout instead of waiting for the payouts over time. And he would tell me a story after story how he would come across individuals that either were so set in their rules, that links back to what we talked about at the beginning, certain habits about money, that money had really no impact on their life. They didn't start spending more. It didn't really disrupt them. They were keeping it really for the kids and the grandkids and the next generation. I work for families with multi-generational wealth. I manage money for families and build stock portfolios for them. So I kind of could relate to that side of the experience that he was telling me about lottery winners. And then there are those that the minute this money comes to them, instead of a cash flow spread out over time, that money is gone because they find a way to spend it and it's just gone. Very disruptive to their life in many different ways. So reading that, I was waiting for the hint of what happens, and I'm not going to give it away what happens in the story. But I was waiting for what happens. And do you have a plan? Let's say you win one of those lotteries in the coming 24 hours. What would happen to your life in the following 24 hours?
It really wouldn't change. I have a mortgage. I would pay off my mortgage, and I would buy a condo in Miami. And aside from that, nothing would really change. And I might buy some more clothes, buy some jewelry, little stuff like that. But really, it's just me and my wife. We don't have kids. So then it really becomes, giving away money is a problem, as you know. Like, even if you intend to give it away, it's complicated. Like, it's very complicated. And that's what I would spend most of my time doing, To
me, the big picture idea is what feels like sudden wealth, one way or the other. And I've seen it with clients, even inherited wealth, that it's coming, but it's this moment where it kind of feels sudden. And you have to make a lot of decisions very quickly. It's very different than if you put away $1,000 every month and put it in an index fund and have a lifetime of savings. But if you sold a business or inherited wealth, and here it is, $30 million or $50 million or $100 million, there are a lot of decisions that have to be made. And I kind of see that as, a miracle in itself. But also I have this idea that there's no dress rehearsal. Like, this is it. It's not that you can play around and see what happens. You have to make the decisions. And it brings me to another story, which means that it was a topic that was also on your mind, because you have a character in one of your stories that says, I'm rich, I inherited 30 million, but you add a couple of things here. You say no strings attached, no trust fund. What made you write that story? How did the inspiration come about, and what can we learn from that experience? A sudden inheritance.
Well, that is a story about a DJ and producer in Miami whose father is a CEO of an industrial concern and inherits a bunch of money. And I I mean, the amount of money he inherited isn't really crucial to the story. Basically, this producer is very introverted, and the mom next door makes advances on him, and so. But that neighborhood in Miami I've been to, it's called the Morningside neighborhood, and there's some very wealthy people in that neighborhood. I'm very familiar with that neighborhood. And that's the type of money it takes to get in that neighborhood, which is one of the reasons why I did that.
I'm sure there are lessons in there too. I want to talk about the other end of the spectrum. There's another story, and the character's name is Logan, from what I remember. And I'll bring up a quote because I think it frames beautifully what Logan is has experienced in life. And there's this quote that says, "There was an inertia associated with being a member of the lower classes. There were no concrete examples of success, the path not taken, nobody had gone before you, so it was impossible to know what it was like." And then you add, "sentenced to a lifetime of mediocrity." Can you talk about that experience? It's a fascinating social discussion here about people that are born in circumstances that don't allow them to even imagine or dream up anything else.
Yeah, so when I was growing up in Connecticut with my mom and my grandmother, my mom was making $10,000 a year. This was in the early 80s. And my grandmother was pulling in some alimony, and that was basically what we lived on. That side of my family had no successful people financially. They had no successful people. There were people that worked for the phone company. There were people that had some small, barely successful businesses. But and that was also true of my town. The town is called Norwich, Connecticut. Wall Street people did not come from Norwich, Connecticut. The high school, which I donate a lot to, has at least at the time did not really have a business program. The school produces great artists, great musicians, great social workers, great writers, but it does not produce business people. It is not a wealthy town. So when I was growing up, like, Wall Street was just an abstraction, right? Like, I would come home, the news would be on, the Dow would be up 40 points, the Dow would be down 60 points. That's really all I knew about Wall Street, is what I saw on the news. I did not know anybody that worked there. I didn't know anybody that worked there. I had no exposure to it whatsoever, right? And it was funny, when I first started looking for jobs on Wall Street, one of my connections at Lehman was a guy who was an over-the-counter trader. He traded NASDAQ stocks. But at the time, they called him an over-the-counter trader. And when he told me that, I had this vision of him, like, standing behind a counter, like, handing out stock certificates. You know what I mean? That was what I knew. Mm-hmm. So if you come from those circumstances, there are no concrete examples of anybody for you to follow. Like, unlike if you grew up in Summit, New Jersey, Darien, Connecticut, Larchmont, New York, there's Wall Street people all around you. Like, it is the path that's taken. Like, you know what that looks like, and it shapes your entire being. You know how to act. You know how to dress. You run in the same social circles. Like, so it's really kind of a larger social statement on how people become successful. It has a lot to do with their background. So.
Well, it makes me want to ask, was there somebody in your life that inspired you to see other opportunities?
No, I just sought it out myself. Yeah.
And can you take us back to that moment just for a second when you decided that you're going to apply for a role at Lehman, or it looks like you were applying for a number of positions in the same area?
How I decided I was going to apply. I was reading a lot of books I was reading a lot of books. Um, the first book I read was the Malkiel book, A Random Walk Down Wall Street. Then I read some books on mutual funds. And then I started reading books about trading. And trading sounded really cool. I decided I wanted to be a trader. Um, and I must have been like 23 years old when I figured that out. But like I said, like I had no exposure to it whatsoever. So I had to learn it all myself. So
Well, I'm glad you did. And here we are talking about it. I don't want to reveal more of the stories, but I have an overarching big picture question, and you kind of hinted, but you have all kinds of characters in the book. You have athletes, musicians, traders, you have a DJ. Do you have a favorite story, a favorite character? And if so, why, out of all the stories you share?
my favorite story is 200 Hours. That's my favorite story. So there was, I really don't want to give this away. I love the dialogue in that story. It's almost a screenplay. The story is almost entirely dialogue, which makes it different from the other stories. There's not a lot of prose. It's entirely dialogue, and it's a romance. It's a love story. And I don't know. Like I feel the strongest connection to that story.
Well, we'll leave it at that on that story, and we'll let the audience explore more. But all of those stories have a little essence to them, and they're very different, but they feel very personal. I kind of have a feeling that you met people, or you were the person that inspired a lot of them, but I'll leave it at that. Jared, I have one last big question. I asked my guests about their definition of success. You've done so many different things. At some point, you were doing 3 things at the same time. You might be doing 3 things at the same time today. But how do you think about success?
I think about success in terms of you want to be the best at what you're doing, no matter what it is, right? If this is a dumb example, but let's say you're at McDonald's and you're flipping burgers. You want to be the best burger flipper in the world. Like you want to be the best at what it is you're doing. I'm not like some elitist snob that says that you can only be successful if you have $100 million, right? There's all different forms of success. If you are a writer, you want to be the best writer. If you're an athlete, you want to be the best athlete. If you are just fill in the blank, low paying job, you want to be the best at that. If you're a teacher, you want to be the best teacher, right? So what do I do the best? Well, I think I have the best financial newsletter that is in existence. I think it's the best, right? Is it the biggest? No. My strengths are in, creative writing, not marketing. So it's not the biggest. But I think it is the best. And, I think when you get to a certain age, I just turned 50, you start to think about what your impact is going to be when you're gone. How are you going to be remembered? What are you going to be remembered for? And that's one of the things that compels me to continue to write books, because the books will outlive me. Like I could die tomorrow, and then 10 years from now, some high school kid could be on Amazon and find one of my books, and then he reads another book, and then he reads another book, and who is this Jared Dillian guy? And he starts searching for me, and maybe does a book report on me. Like, I want to continue to live beyond my own death. That's what motivates me. So,
well, I love the sound of that, and I'm looking forward to many more books. Is it fair to ask if you have some ideas that you can share that are on your mind that you want to write about, or you want to keep it a secret?
No, so I'm going to have a book coming out next year. It's another collection of essays like Those Bastards. It's going to be called Rule 62, Meditations on Success and Spirituality. So that's coming out next summer. And then I have a book contract to write a book called The Awesome Portfolio, which is going to come out in 2026. And then after that, hopefully in 2027, I'm going to have a novel. And the tentative title for it is Round Zero. and it's a dystopian fiction novel. I've written a little bit of it already. I think it has the potential to be a big hit. I think it has great movie potential. So, so that's what's happening over the next couple of years.
What's the awesome portfolio?
With the awesome portfolio, I talked a little bit about it in No Worries. So basically, the way we save for retirement is really dumb. Like you mentioned before, like putting money in an index fund. The conventional wisdom is you save for retirement by dollar cost averaging into an index fund, and you experience this breathtaking volatility, up 20%, down 20%. We have a big bear market, down 50%, and you are supposed to ride out the volatility. And then when you retire, you'll have X number of $1 million, right? That is the complete wrong way to do it. So two things. Number one, most people can't withstand that kind of volatility, right?
True.
At some point in a 40-year investing career, we will have a 50% drawdown. And how you behave in that drawdown determines everything. And most people will sell, like a lot of people did in 2008. Okay. And if you sell, you stop compounding and it's game over. Okay. Or let's say you manage to not sell during a giant drawdown and you continue to invest. It is going to cause you an enormous amount of stress. You experiencing that drawdown, even if you do hold on, it's going to cause you an enormous amount of stress. You're going to see your life savings go from $1 million to $500,000, right? And you're going to be thinking about retiring, and you're going to be curtailing consumption and all this stuff. So the way to do it is to diversify across asset classes. So you invest in stocks, bonds, gold, cash, and real estate, those 5 things. And what that does is you lose a little bit in terms of performance, about 1%, but it cuts your volatility in half. And the worst drawdown that you can ever have is 12% historically. That's the worst drawdown you've ever had. So if you say, all right, I'm going to accept 1% less in returns, and I'm going to have half the volatility, and my worst year is going to be down 12%, that's a no-brainer. And that's called the awesome portfolio. So
when you say real estate, you mean REITs?
So the way you can do it is you can either count the equity that's in your house, or if you don't own a house, you can do REITs. So, yes.
You touched on something fascinating, because I have this idea that anybody can buy a stock, but not many people can hold it. And I have still a very vivid memory of March of 2020. And I took a lot of calls from clients. They told me they just wanted to hear my voice. And I took calls from people that I respect in the business that could not handle the volatility of March of 2020. And some of them decided to exit the market, which proved to be, very uncomfortable, painful because of the recovery that followed, and they couldn't catch up. But I think you point out something interesting, that the solution that I found, and I don't know if it works for everybody, but I like the idea that I know the businesses that I hold, and it gives me a lot more peace and a lot of more connection in terms of ownership than owning an index fund that has 100 or 1,000 stocks. So that even in the drawdown, I look at it as I continue to own stakes in 30 some businesses that I know the balance sheets, I know who is running them, I know how they're doing, and it gives me a lot more peace of mind. And maybe that's been the biggest secret why I was able to hold on to these through those times that, as you mentioned, will repeat. And I don't know what would have happened if I was just holding a collection of index funds, that I can't have the same attachment and sense of ownership. Although I do think that the index funds, play a role and they're useful. I'm not saying that they're not. But me personally, I like to know what I own, and it allows me to stay invested in the times that you mentioned where we make the biggest difference. And it's so just easy to just sell the index fund and move on. But if you own businesses, at least it helps me. I don't know if you have any thoughts about it. I'm curious.
No, I don't have any thoughts. No.
I think you have to choose what works for you. I think the overarching lesson is, investing makes sense. and then find your way to remain invested in the times that are hard. And maybe an awesome portfolio is one way of going about it and avoiding the volatility. Jared, it was such a pleasure to have you. I highly recommend all the books, and especially the last one, Beautiful Stories. It's one of those books that you can take one story at a time and enjoy it and dive into a very different world with every little story. And we just touch on a handful, but there's so much more in the book. Thank you so much for today. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.